So I'll just jump right on in. Welcome. My name is Dawn Ellis, and I'm the Director of Programs and Community Partnerships with Room 217. And I can't believe we're already in March. And just again, for those joining us, it is March break here in Ontario. And so for those folks connected to youth in schools, we'll be sending out a message that this webinar will be uploaded to our website as they are usually anyways. And so today we have Erin Parkes, who's going to be really discussing fostering connection through community music and other things going on. This is actually a pretty hot off the press sort of conference update that we will be having our conference this November in Mississauga. So we're coming back to Ontario to engage with especially those caregivers that we've been working with over the last several years. But in Ontario, we've been working with 11 long-term care homes. And so I will also announce that the focus or the theme of this year's conference will be the power of a song and music and dementia. So that's pretty exciting coming out of the gates. And of course, we have later this year, much later this year, I'll just announce that we've just are in the middle of creating a using guitar in care virtual learning studio, which is pretty exciting. So later this year, probably around conference time in November, we'll be releasing a virtual learning studio on guitar techniques. And so we have our standard three-level training. And also another update is our music care training level 1 is going to be offered through McMaster's continuing education program in the fall, which is an exciting development. So that's coming up later this year in the fall. But our regular courses, we have a level 2 coming up on March 19th and 20th, so next week. Level 3 in May, and level 1 coming up in May as well. After our amazing webinar today, the next one is going to be the role of music in complicated grief with Eugene Dufour. And again, here are some QR codes if you want to, I'll just rest here for a moment if you want to use the QR code to access more information. And our social media. And if you are collecting hours for your CEUs, you can go ahead and email Tanya Albus, talbus@room217.ca. But a little bit more about today. Erin Parkes holds a PhD in music education from McGill University, where she researched how to train studio music teachers to work with students with autism. In 2012, Dr. Parkes founded Lotus Centre for Special Music Education, a charitable organization committed to providing access to music education for people with exceptionalities. In addition to her role at the Lotus Centre, Dr. Parkes is an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, where she is also a researcher at the Music and Health Research Institute. Dr. Parkes presents at conferences and guest lectures internationally on teaching music to students with exceptionalities and other issues in music education. And today, the theme, Fostering Connection Through Community Music, I'm personally very excited as I have a degree in community music from Laurier, but community music is a form of music making or music education that stresses a collaborative approach to music learning. If there is a leader in the group, they are often seen as a facilitator rather than a teacher in the traditional sense, providing guidance to the group of musicians while allowing the musicians to direct their own learning. There is increasing research that demonstrates that community music making can have positive impacts on mental health and well-being. However, there has also been little attention paid to the structures that facilitate successful community music making. In this webinar, we'll discuss a study of 3 leading community music centers in Canada, the Community Music Schools of Toronto, the McLachlan School of Music, and the Lotus Centre for Special Music Education, in which we explored the ways that we meet the needs of vulnerable populations, including racialized students, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, students who have experienced trauma, and students with disabilities. We identified common approaches that are taken to create enriching environments for students from those populations, and they will explore those approaches and how they use relationship and music making to improve well-being. So I'm going to welcome Erin and stop sharing my screen and welcome Erin. And we'll be holding questions at the end. And again, we're super thrilled to have you discussing your research. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm really happy to be here. And thanks to all of you for spending your time here learning about community music. I'm going to share my slides now. Okay. So as Dawn said, I'm going to be talking about a research project today. It is a research project, but it's very much research to practice. It came about because our three organizations, Lotus Centre, where I'm the founder and executive director, Sarah McLachlan School of Music, and Community Music Schools of Toronto, we're all like meeting bi-weekly. We met at the Music and Health Research Institute conference and through that organization, and just saw a lot of commonalities between our organizations and really just enjoyed talking to each other and learning from each other what we were doing. And in talking about sort of our similarities and our differences, we just became really interested in learning more about that. So our project really came about just because we wanted to learn more about each other's centers and how they can influence the work that we're doing. And then we thought, well, if we're interested in it, maybe other people are interested in it too, and what different community music centers are doing. So this project really involved just us sort of exploring what's going on at our centers. And here I'm going to share with you some of what we found there. And so this is really sort of a multiple case study sort of approach. But between the three of us, our work covers a lot of students and quite a lot of teachers. So our research team was myself, Andrea Unrau from the Sarah McLachlan School of Music, Stephen Fisk from the Sarah McLachlan School of Music, and Richard Marcella from Community Music Schools of Toronto. So in this project, really our purpose was to explore how community music supports diverse needs. And so this involved looking at our organizational structures and what policies need to be in place to serve the different communities. This might seem kind of dry, but it's actually really important. And, some of the things that we've found are really looking at what the barriers are to participation in the communities with which we're working, and what sort of policies or structures we have in place to remove those barriers. So there are pedagogical approaches that remove those barriers, but there are also things like, are all our services free of charge? What sorts of policies do we have around who can, be part of our organizations? Are we looking for, proof of economic status or anything like that? And so in this project, the point that we're at now is that we've looked at those organizational structures and seen sort of what we think needs to be in place. And we've also looked at pedagogical approaches that our educators are taking. And so we did this through a few things. We have done things like observe each other's lessons. I actually just was in Toronto last week for a week, just observing what is happening there, and meeting with our teachers and just gathering as much information as we can. Our next step will be then to go back to the schools after we've looked at the structures and the pedagogical approaches and look at the effects of on the well-being of students. So that's going to be next year. This year was really looking at what those approaches are, and then our next step is looking at what the impacts are. So I'm going to go through a little bit, give a little bit of information about the three organizations that were involved. So Lotus Centre is my organization. We're based in Ottawa, and we're a community music school that focuses on helping students with exceptionalities reach their full potential through music and community. We really work with all students with disabilities. So we're not specific to autism or, any particular condition. It's anybody with any exceptionality. They don't necessarily require a diagnosis. It's anybody that needs any kind of adaptive instruction. We're here for them. We give private and group lessons. We have about 180 students a week that come for that. But a huge part of our work is our camps. We do summer camp all summer, PD day camp, March break camp. We have Sunday afternoon camp. So we see about 550 students per year. And we do a lot of community outreach. So going into special education classrooms, day programs, group homes, that kind of thing. So that's the bulk of our work. We see about 1,200 per year. The community served for us is the disability communities throughout Ottawa. And I think it's really important to identify what community we're talking about when we're talking about community music. Sometimes we're talking about a cultural community or a geographic community. So for us, it's really the disability community, which is actually a lot of different communities, but we see it as the disability community as a whole. The Sarah McLachlan School of Music is out on the west end, the Western Canada. They have 3 locations in Vancouver, Surrey, and Edmonton. And their focus is on building communities where all can experience connection, personal growth, and well-being through equitable access to supportive, creative, and inclusive musical learning and expression. So they do almost exclusively group classes for ages 9 to 18. They have about 1,100 students between their three different locations. And their community served is youth of low socioeconomic status in neighboring areas to their locations. And the Community Music Schools of Toronto has 2 locations in Toronto, one in Regent Park and one in the Jane Finch area. And their focus is on mentoring and inspiring youth toward connection, confidence, capability, and well-being through musical discovery and community engagement. They work with through private and group classes up to age 18, and they have about 850 students. And the community that they serve is racialized and low socioeconomic status in neighboring areas. So again, in Regent Park and Jane Finch, their focus is quite geographic. So I want to go through how we define a community music in this project, because there are a lot of sort of different definitions of community music and different ways of looking at community music. Very often community music is really focused on group music making. And this can happen anywhere. It can be, once a week in a church basement. It can be, doing an hour choir once a week or anything. It doesn't need to be large scale like in these music schools. And very often when we look at research and community music, it is looking at those sorts of interventions. So like a choir that runs once a week or a guitar class or something like that. There are not many studies that are looking at larger organizations and how they're making it happen. So that's sort of why we wanted to take on this project. But it's worth noting here that partially because we're larger scale, our approach to community music is a little bit more holistic. So the way that we're looking at it is not necessarily that it needs to be, a group class or it needs to be, um, completely student-led or always this sort of um, collaborative approach where everybody's sort of just making music together. Sometimes we do see it with more of a teacher as well. But it varies depending on the needs of the students because we're working with so many students. So our definition is that community music believes that everyone has the right and ability to make, create, and enjoy their own music, and that active music making should be encouraged and supported at all ages and all levels of society. That community music is open to all, cooperative, non-judgmental, and process-centered. It prioritizes accessibility, equal opportunity, and active participation in music making. The community music is not competitive, formal, exclusionary, talent-based, egocentric, or product-centered. So you'll see as I go through that a lot of the discussion is about process over product, and this sort of very open approach. But it's worth noting too that private lessons are a part of it, whereas often with community music, we see it focused on groups. Particularly at Lotus Centre, that's a consideration because of the community. A lot of our students at Lotus Centre don't do well in groups, particularly students that we have that have severe or profound intellectual disability and really need one-on-one support. So for our community, private lessons might be best. And so in this, when we have a larger music school, sometimes we're going to see more variation in what that looks like. And that's sort of part of what we found when we were looking at this is that when there are so many students, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of students, there's huge variety in what community music looks like. So what do we know about community music? As Tom was saying in the description, we know that it improves well-being. There's a lot of research showing the benefits of community music, but here are some, and just some specifics. There's a lot out there on this. It builds belonging and social cohesion. It creates positive emotions. I mean, music making always creates positive emotions, or always can. That's not specific to community music, but we do know that that can be an outcome of community music. It supports creativity. It can combat loneliness. It provides a support network, improved well-being for those with mental health conditions, and improved quality of life for older people. Some of these are very intervention specific, and some are just general participation. So, for example, there are some community music research projects that are looking at people with specific health conditions. So, perhaps health conditions that have to do with lung function, and they're doing singing to see if there can be support there. There are lots that look at people, older people or people with early stages of Alzheimer's, and the support network that can be created there, particularly with caregivers involved. So there are so many different facets to this, but I'm giving sort of more the general overview of the impact that community music can have. So our data collection, this is our research team, Richard Marcella, myself, Andrea Unround, Stephen Fisk, that's us at Lotus Centre a few weeks ago. So here are the things that we looked at in collecting our data. We did interviews with all the organizational leadership to learn about what they saw as their mission, what they were trying to achieve with impact, how they were making sure that there was sort of cohesion amongst their faculty and their staff, that everybody was working together to make sure that they were achieving what they wanted to achieve. We did a review of the policies that support community. We observed a lot of music sessions, a lot of music sessions. We did a lot of observation to try to get to really understand the breadth of what's happening at each of our locations. And we did fairly lengthy faculty discussion sessions where we brought together as many faculty members as we could to do some breakout rooms and talk with them about how they viewed their role, how they tried to create these benefits and these impacts in music education, pedagogical approaches that they were taking and how they were approaching it. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. There are 6 themes that emerged from all of this work that we were doing, and I'm going to go through each one in quite a lot of detail. So these are the themes that emerged from all of that data collection. Centering the strengths and the needs of the student, collaborative and accessible approaches to pedagogy, programming choices that reflect student interest, a staff network with a shared purpose, targeting specific communities who can benefit, and the importance of relationship. But overarching all of that was the idea of removing barriers. and that being sort of the most important piece. And that can be financial barriers. So, for example, for Community Music Schools of Toronto and Sarah McLachlan School of Music, all of their programming is free because the barrier that their community is facing is often an economic barrier, financial barrier. For Lotus Centre, that's not necessarily the barrier that our families are facing. It's barriers of adaptive programming and access to programming that is um, targeted towards the population of people with disabilities. So that's the barrier we're trying to remove by adapting specifically for those communities. So there are different ways of doing that depending on the community, but that's kind of at the crux of what we're trying to do is removing barriers. So now going through each one, centering the strengths and the needs of the student. So there was a lot of the focus on student agency was very apparent. And one of the teachers in one of the sessions said that it can lead to an extraordinary adventure, which I thought was a really nice way of looking at it. There was a lot of emphasis from the teachers on their own sort of journey through this, which I thought was really beautiful. And so by student agency, I mean that students are making choices um, about the direction of their learning. And this could look like a lot of different things too. It could mean just things like the students are choosing what programs they want to be in. It could be that the students are choosing what songs they want to work on. It could be that they're choosing how they're going to work on it. Down at the bottom there, I talk about universal design for learning, which is different ways of engaging with the material that's there. So this was seen to be a really, really important piece, is giving the students some control. It's very different from a sort of more traditional music education top-down approach, right? And especially we see this in classical music. I know I was classically trained. I'm a pianist. I did Royal Conservatory. That's my background. It's very much the teacher has a curriculum in mind. You know, there are certain things that everybody needs to learn. And the focus is really on the teacher getting everything that they have in their head into the heads of their students. And I really, saw that distinction here in observing everything that's happening here and knowing our own work at Lotus Centre is that in traditional education, it's very much sort of a head-to-head approach. I want what's in my head to get in my student's head. And one thing that we really saw here was it was much more of a sort of person to person approach or heart to heart approach, really wanting to understand the experience that our student is having and engaging with them on a human level to go on this journey together through music. So it was really not about, I want them to get the knowledge that I have. Not that there's not a piece of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it was more, let me really be in the student's shoes, listen to what their experience is, and then walk alongside them and bring them through the learning. And, it might seem like then there's not as much focus on the goals, and there's not. The focus is on that adventure and on that journey. And developing student agency can be a big part of that because a lot of students maybe don't have a lot of opportunity to have a lot of agency in their learning in other ways. So facilitating that agency is actually one of the benefits, one of the sort of learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve is helping them achieve that agency in their own learning. It can mean tailoring our approach and curriculum. And so I really saw that at all three sites. And I know at Lotus Centre, we're really all about that, is every student was very different. And going from one student to the next, teacher to teacher, or class to class, or even within a class with all different students, there was a very different approach taken, and the curriculum was different depending on the group. So, for example, I even saw I would see two group piano classes, and there would be a completely different approach and totally different curriculum, even though it was the same teacher. It was very much focused on who the students are, what they need, and then tailoring it to that. So, for example, I saw one group piano class where there was a whole section where they danced. And my first thought, with a background in more traditional piano and having taught a lot of group piano lessons is, well, dance isn't, they're not playing piano. This is a piano class. But that's how the students interacted with the music. And the teacher was playing piano and they were really actively listening. And I thought that it was really beautiful that the teacher tapped into, this was it was all girl class. And they really seemed to enjoy the dancing. And they were allowed a lot of creativity. She asked them to work in pairs, so they would get together and work on what their dance was going to be together. So that, in itself is a great learning outcome, is to work together to produce this. And I saw her other class and it was a boy class and there was no dancing because I don't think those boys would have been so into the dancing. So it was very tailored to appeal to the students. A focus on mental health and creating safe spaces for students. It was always paramount and came up a lot in the information that the teachers gave us. But also interestingly, what they talked about there was not just focusing on creating a safe space for it's creating safe spaces for the students, but not just considering the students' well-being, but also considering their own well-being. And, we talk a lot at Lotus Centre, and I know they do at CMST and Sarah McLachlan School of Music as well, on teacher burnout and compassion fatigue. And these can be real issues when we're working with students who have had trauma or have high needs, who need a lot of support. And so there was a lot of talk from the teachers about bringing their own well-being into the space, and that is part of what creates a safe space for students, that sort of considering their own needs as well, because we know that when we come into a classroom stressed and frazzled, we can't be there for our students, and our students pick up on it and they feel that. And so if we come in, in a good place ourselves, then we're ready for this and we can support our students. There's a lot of talk about strengths-based approach. So looking at where our students are strongest and developing an approach around that, rather than just taking the same approach, teaching by reading notes, for example, even if students aren't great at that, but also then not just learning by ear or by rote. If some students learn best by reading, having some reading available for them. If they learn best by rote, that's fine. Then they can learn by rote. All of these things being okay. And as I mentioned, universal design for learning. This is a whole approach that's very common in classroom learning and special education especially, which uses multiple means of representation. So multiple ways that the teacher is presenting the material, multiple means of expression. So multiple ways that the student can demonstrate their learning, and multiple means of engagement. So different ways that we can create meaning for the student with the material. So making sure that we have material that has cultural significance, for example, or that relates to an experience that the student had. So making sure that that was in place, especially when we were doing group learning, so that it could be there could be meaning for every student and that they could find themselves in what they were doing, and feel like they're really part of this experience. Next, we talked about what came out a lot was collaborative and accessible approaches to pedagogy. So the teacher as a facilitator of the experience of making music, rather than the teacher as like a leader, or like I said, like a top-down teacher. So the teacher is just there to create the environment where music learning can happen, to guide it. But for sure to set the curriculum, have lesson plans. Everybody talked about the need for some structure and how to find flow with that structure or how to be flexible with that structure because it doesn't always work what we plan out for our lessons. But really, there was this focus on feeling like they're there to just be part of this musical experience with their students. And one of the teachers said they approach it with a playful and participatory spirit, which I thought was really beautiful. We talked about accessible alternatives to traditional music teaching. And there was talk of cheering each other on. And the discussion around that was um, encouraging the students to cheer each other on. And the teachers gave some examples of when they saw that. And I could certainly give examples too. There were many times that I saw that in the classes that the students were being very encouraging of each other or helping each other, but also the students and the teachers or a student and the facilitator. And some of the teachers talked about vulnerability themselves. So them trying something that's new for them, or letting the students tell them what they should try too, and them trying it, even if they're not that great at it. That idea that they don't need to be experts, which is what we often see for teachers, but that they're just there having the experience as well. They may have expertise, they probably do, but there are things that are new for all of us and not being afraid to explore those things. Taking a flexible and generative approach, so letting things unfold naturally in the class. Again, that idea of like having an idea of like not ever going into a class without an idea of what you want to do. That would be a little bit dangerous from my perspective as a teacher. I'm a very structured person, so that would be very difficult for me. Maybe some people would work better that way than I would. But allowing the students to sort of take it somewhere and to be ready to move with it. But finding a way to do that so it doesn't just feel like chaos and that you're still sort of guiding the goals that are happening. I've said a couple times already, emphasis on the process over the product. All three schools did talk about wanting to meet some musical goals, wanting to help their students really develop skills, talking about the impact that it can have for students to feel like they're developing skills, but to let that happen without judgment. That it's just going to happen sort of organically through the process of making music. They do recitals, they do performances, but the performances are just sort of them doing in front of other people what they do in their classroom. There's not this idea that it needs to be polished and perfect. They're sharing their experience of music making. We presume competence, so we presume that our students can do things. It doesn't need to be what we think they should do. Whatever they can do and whatever they're showing us is great. And differentiation. So looking at each student's needs and differentiating our instruction for them. We talked about programming choices that reflect student interests. So one thing that came up was using a low barrier musical toolkit. And this was really reflected in the different types of classes that a lot of the programs had. So, for example, at Community Music Schools of Toronto, they have a DJ class, which was so much fun. And being classically trained, it's not something that I'd ever experienced, and it was actually really cool for me to see this. But there are a lot of skills that are required, but they're not the same kinds of skills as playing piano. So having these different ins for people that require different skill sets, so people can jump in and engage with music learning in any way that works for them and is of interest. We talked about allowing for co-creation. So, for example, in one of the DJ classes that I saw, it was a private class, so one-on-one, and the student was, developing what they were working on, and the teacher was just developing it with them. He wasn't dictating anything. The student was saying what songs he wanted to include. The student was figuring out where he wanted to fade from one song to the other. The teacher was then just showing him technically how to do it. And so there really wasn't an idea that the teacher had of what the student needs to learn. He was there to facilitate the student in discovering the music making himself. Having various access points for the students, and no set pathway through the program. So the student, again, it's that idea of agency. They're deciding what they want to do, how quickly they're going to do it. They can go from, one instrument to another. That's fine. It's all about where they want to learn and what they're interested in. The word fun came up a lot, which I thought was really fantastic. I know for me, with the Lotus Center teachers, I was really happy to hear them talk about fun so much. And, that their focus is creating a fun environment for their student. But they also talked about how much fun it is for them. And that they are also focused on having fun with their students. They're taking their jobs very seriously. They do a great job. They put a lot into it. But when it comes right down to it, their view and what they reflected back was, well, music making should be fun. That's, why people love music. And it's fun for us too, as musicians and music teachers. So we're bringing that approach to the music making more than we need to meet these musical goals or develop these musical skills. It's more, we're going to have fun together making music, and we're all going to learn and develop skills because we're making music. But the most important thing is that we're enjoying it. That's really when it brings something really positive to our lives, is when we're enjoying it. And there was very much an awareness that when we're working with these students who are maybe struggling in different parts of their lives, what we want to bring them more than anything else is joy and fun. And so there was very much an awareness that we need to be feeling that and bringing that to the classroom ourselves. And we talked a lot about accessible alternatives to traditional approaches. I did see things like piano lessons. But for the most part, they were very different. It was like a lot of improvisation, a lot of using the piano as a tool for exploring different elements of music. There was playing pieces and repertoire and that kind of thing, but there was a lot of divergence from that as well. Faculty with a shared purpose. So I saw very much in all three schools that the faculty really had a shared mission. There was a focus on really allowing all of the teachers to share their gifts with the school, with their students, of course, but also with the school, and contributing themselves what they thought that their students should learn, and suggesting classes based on what they saw in their students. Um, there was guidance and approaches at each school. Each school has its own sort of feel to it. But largely the teachers were allowed to teach in a way that is authentic to them. And the idea of authenticity is something that came up quite a lot. And this feeling that for us to go into the classroom and hold on to our own well-being, we need to be authentic. So for some of us, that means taking a structured approach. For me, that's the way it has to be. If I'm letting it be a little bit, really just kind of like going with wherever students want it to go, I have a hard time. I need a little bit more structure. So I find ways that my students can bring back to me where they want to go, but I still maintain the structure. So it might mean, for example, that I know I'm going to do an opening activity, and then I'm going to do a rhythm song, and then I'm going to do, some sort of listening game or whatever. And I have these things in mind, but when I get to each activity, I work with the students to do it together. With some of our students, at Lotus Center in particular, with a lot of autistic students or students with different needs, they really thrive on a lot of structure and even having like a visual schedule. So I'll do things like have a visual schedule where I have those things. It might be a hello song, then a rhythm game, then a listening game, or whatever it might be, but not with a lot of specifics, just those titles. So they can still follow the structure and there is a structure, but there's a lot of room within each one to go where the student wants it to go. The teachers talked a lot about knowledge sharing between them and about staff connection and collaboration. And one of the quotes that came out of one of the staff sessions was bringing an attitude of wonderment of ability, which I thought was really wonderful that they all have this sort of shared idea of wonderment at what their students can do. And, I think that the hope is that most teachers have that, but that it's really important to have that culture in a community music school. And that comes from everybody coming together and talking about it, and sort of this shared belief in it. And so that was really apparent at all of the schools that the staff do get together and have this sort of shared culture of wonderment at what their students can do. We talked about targeting the specific communities who can benefit. So having policies and procedures that reflect community needs. So for example, at all of them, there were not really um, any rules set around attendance. So like I can speak to, our community at Lotus Centre. We have a lot of students that struggle a lot with maybe changes in routine or getting out the door, or, sometimes we have parents that call and say, I just can't get them into the car today. And that's fine. So we allow for that because that's what our community needs. We're working in dialogue with our community. So um, that can mean that we are talking with parents, talking with other community members to make sure that what we're offering is meeting the needs. So, for example, at Lotus Center, as I said at the beginning, we have a lot of camps. We didn't start out with a lot of camps, but we really heard from the community that it's very difficult to find music camps or any summer camp really, but music camps, especially for students with special needs. And so we grew and grew and grew our camp programs, and now we offer many camps, and often our waiting list is double what we can give. We really see the need for camp in our community, so we're working on being able to offer more. But we only learn that by talking with our community and learning about what they need. And we see that as a huge part of community music to make sure we're offering what serves the community. We also saw a lot of work around cultural sensitivity and representation. So, at Community Music Schools of Toronto, there's a lot of cultural diversity on their team because that's representative of the community with which they're working. At Lotus Centre, we have a lot of staff that are neurodivergent or have disabilities because that's the community with which we're working. And we want to make sure that there's representation of our community so that there is enhanced cultural sensitivity there. There's an emphasis on accessibility. And we talked already about removing barriers. So geographic barriers by having multiple locations for all three organizations. And particularly even for Lotus Center, we do a lot of outreach because it is sometimes difficult for our students to come to us. So we go into their classrooms or their day programs or their group homes so that we can make it more accessible and we can bring the music making experience to them so they can still benefit. The other benefit there is that they're making music with their existing, with their friends and with their peers. And so it's something that they can do to sort of enhance their relationships in their already existing community. Financial, free or subsidized programs, and pedagogical. So our programs being student-led and adaptive. And finally, we talked about the importance of relationship. And this was really at the forefront of what we were doing. We talked a lot about authenticity and openness. And one of the quotes was emotional sincerity. And it was even brought up that, our students carry trauma, we carry trauma ourselves. All of us bring our own trauma and our own experiences into our teaching. And not feeling like that needs to be something that we leave at the door, understanding that it's with us all the time and it can be a point of connection, not that we're necessarily talking about it with the student, but we can let our own experiences connect with our students in that way. Going back to the sort of person to person teaching, allowing there to be that emotional connection so that we can, again, understand the student's experience. It's really important with students, especially that have come from trauma or are facing barriers, to build trust. And trust comes from authenticity. So there was a lot of talk about that needing to be there first, before we're working on any other musical goals. I talked already about consciously bringing well-being to the environment, our own and the students. And one of the teachers talked about an attitude of calm acceptance. And so I thought that that was a really lovely way to put it, that we're just there and present with the student. Sometimes we have students that may be exhibiting challenging behaviors. Sometimes we may have students that are sitting with their arms crossed and don't really want to participate. That's all okay. It's all okay. We're just there making music and we're ready when they're ready to jump in, and we offer them lots of different things to encourage them to participate. And if they don't, that's okay. I was in one drumming class at Community Music Schools of Toronto, and there was a student like that. He was having none of it that day. The other kids were all into it, and he said these kids were maybe 5 or 6 years old. He just said, "I'm having a bad day. I don't want to do anything." And the teacher said, "Okay." And every once in a while, he would ask him, "Do you want to try now?" And the student would say, "No." "Okay." Eventually, though, he asked a couple times, every time they started a new activity, "Do you want to try?" Or if the kids were taking turns on the drum, "Oh, do you want to try now?" And eventually he did. But it was just that process of just letting him be who he was in that moment, letting him just sit with his arms crossed for a while if that's what he needed to do. I saw other classes where students kind of went off and did their own thing in the corner, and that was fine. And there's just this sort of calm and gentle encouragement to participate. And when the student, in every situation that I saw, when the student was ready, they did. But even more than that, the student knew that it was okay, that anything they were coming into the classroom with was okay. And that is really, really key to creating a positive and accepting community music experience. So that's it for my presentation. So I'm going to stop my share and open it up now to any questions.
Thank you so much for a deep dive into the research and the work that you've been doing. It was exciting. I will say, are there any questions from the floor now? You can either put it in the chat or feel free to put yourself back on camera and ask away. Joy, go for it.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Parkes, for your presentation and also for just this opportunity today. Thank you. So my question is, I wrote it down here somewhere. When you were doing your observations of all of these places, were you using any specific observation protocol? Like, did you have any? And please tell me what it was.
Yeah. So we had forms that we were filling out where we looked at just what activities were done. But the main thing that we were looking at it was how the teacher engaged with the students, any differentiation that we saw. So, if it was a classroom, how the teacher maybe, it went back, it was kind of based on the universal design for learning. So what are different ways that the teacher presented the material? What are different ways that the teacher encouraged the students to participate? What were some options that were given there? So you can try this, or you can try this, or so-and-so, do you want to do this? And also ways that the teacher tried to create meaning for the students. So in a lot of instances, I saw, oh, so-and-so, you talked about this a few weeks ago. Do you want to try that now? So bring like really listening to what the students were saying and communicating and bringing it back to that so that they knew that they were connecting it with something that was important to the student. Now, I will say that's sort of what we were looking for. It's not to say we always saw those things, so sometimes we didn't see everything, but those were sort of the things we had in our form we really wanted to understand, because those are sort of community music things that we talk about. So are we seeing those things in action? And then we sort of had room for just general notes, like anything that we noticed that wasn't in that, but those were sort of the categories that we had in our forms that we filled out.
And that was all designed by the team, I presume.
Yep, it was designed by all four of us, yeah, working together.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.
And I'm wondering if there's any other questions from the floor.
Um, Good afternoon, everyone. It's not a question for me, but it's the first I'm having a workshop like this, and I'm really impressed by the information that you shared here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Good.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for your positive feedback. That's always wonderful to hear after you've given a presentation. Thank you for that. Well, on that note, I want to thank you on behalf of Room 217, and I look forward to kind of watching more work, and more research. I know you're heavily involved in that, so that's pretty exciting. And again, for those of us, those educators, I know we will be sending out a message that this will be uploaded to our website later. And I wish everybody a great rest of your week. Thank you so much, Erin.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Oh, Joy, I
Oh.
see your note. That's fine with me.
We'll be able to let you stay on for 2 minutes, but it's our Zoom link. That's all. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, everyone.